All right. Well, welcome everybody to Breaching the Boardroom. I am your host, David Morrow, and in the studio today is a very special guest. It is Dr. Douglas Slakey, an internationally recognized transplant surgeon, healthcare professional, founding chair of health systems science at the First College of Medicine, Belmont University, also the best-selling author of The Process Manifesto, Improving Healthcare in a Complex World. Doug is a highly committed and embraces the philosophy of patient centric medical care. Doctor, welcome to the studio.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure. So, share with us what your current leadership role is and what you're kind of seeing overall, and then
Yeah,
I want to back into kind of how you got there and your origin story.
well, I'd love to. So, yeah, it's a very exciting time. So, I was recruited here to Nashville and arrived in mid-July of last year. Brand new medical school at Belmont University called the Thomas F. Frist Junior College of Medicine. And a beautiful building, 60,000 square feet of simulation space, all the new educational technology. And two things really honestly excited me about this opportunity. First is the mission of the medical school is really predicated on the idea that we need to teach physicians and by extension, all healthcare providers about appreciating the longitudinal whole person healthcare journey. So often we've done amazing work looking at high acuity care. And I can speak as someone, has done over 500 liver transplants, 1,000 kidney transplants. So I know about the high acuity, and they're very highly rewarding and life saving. But arguably, we haven't consistently spent enough time thinking about patient healthcare over the long term. And how do we really impact that? I think, it's top of mind with Make America Healthy Again and some of the things that are going on that we can talk about. But anyway, that really excited me for that opportunity. And then the other thing, I had sort of decided I had probably done enough surgery to last 3 lifetimes and was ready to try something a little different. So there's this new concept of health system science, which is foundationally the idea that we should be teaching nurses, doctors, pharmacists, and others in the healthcare field something about the systems in which they work. Now, in other industries, that would sound like common sense, but we've never really done that in healthcare education. And what I saw the opportunity here really, and what I'm super excited about, is that within this idea of health systems, we can think about different focus areas. And what I'm really committed to is how can we leverage education, innovation, technology, and resource alignment to empower people on the front lines of healthcare? How can we optimize the performance of both the healthcare professional and the patient? And so we've started this Belmont Collaborative for Health System Innovation, which is just growing like crazy, including internationally. And we're about to announce our first large philanthropic gift to get us really started. So very exciting times.
That's fantastic. Yeah, you certainly have conducted a lot of surgeries, and that is several lifetimes of experience. That's wonderful what you've done.
Yep.
I've got a question. You mentioned about how one of the missions is to embrace the training and the systems that the healthcare providers. Why do you think that is? That there might be how deep of a gap could be arguable or variable depending on the campus or the system, but in general, like, why do you think that is? Is it because healthcare providing has been going on for centuries, right? And then the systems have kind of modernized and wrapped around them?
Well, I think that's really, that's a really astute observation. I think, we've been historically, and for good reason, historically focused on, in many ways, isolating the physician in particular from the system. And the idea initially was, well, if the system will support the patient and the physician interaction, the privacy concerns, the relationship, It's a very special relationship, obviously, between a patient and a physician. I think that, there are very few professions, maybe the clergy and priests and some others, where you have that incredible intimate knowledge of people and the motivations that relate to healthcare. So,
Oftentimes, yeah, and oftentimes it's truly life or death for the person.
yes, well, many times, right?
Right.
And so I think there was this belief that the system would sort of support that patient physician interaction. But as healthcare has modernized and become increasingly complex, and even the systems in which we work, and I always use systems plural
Mhm.
because it's different for every patient and arguably for many aspects of the individual patient journey, right? You see different providers, you have different places where you get care, your pharmacy might be different, all these different elements that come together. And so we we largely ignored it. And then I think what we've come to realize over the last short period of time, maybe a decade or two, is that much of the healthcare outcomes that we're seeing really are dependent on the system, which the patient and the physician have so little control over currently.
Right. Why is that? Like, what do you think causes that?
Well, it's a couple of things. I think one is at some level, if you're really busy and you're committed and passionate about providing healthcare, you tend to myopically focus on just what you're doing. And
Right.
and to a certain degree, that's
Like treating the specific disease that they have or the condition that they
specific
have.
disease, specific patient encounter. For a proceduralist, the procedure. And so you tend to isolate yourself in that way. But I think that's been unfortunately detrimental because what we've seen a disengagement between an increasingly centralized system, which is pushing requirements, regulations, pre-approvals for procedures in medicine is a great example. The system is pushing these requirements increasingly to the point of healthcare delivery. And then as a consequence, those creates mistrust, creates disenfranchisement, some of the burnout that we're seeing, and also arguably can increase inefficiencies, and that results in increased
Yeah, I
costs.
can see that. Yeah, I mean, that really makes sense. That's a great observation because are you saying, or it seems to me like the systems are creating certain processes, or you need to do this first before you do this, whereas relying on the expertise and the intimate knowledge that the physician has and letting the physician make the call. Is that what's happening, kind of,
Yes, I
generally
think
speaking?
Yes, I think exactly. And there are two elements to that that I think are really important that I highlight in the book. One is when we look at the processes, we have far too often, in my belief, tried to reduce complicated and complex realities of patient care delivery to a highly linear, predictable structure. And
Right.
that's a fallacy. You cannot reduce complexity consistently to a linear process. And
Well, you talk about leaders needing to embrace the complexity and
yeah,
kind of to think high level about it and to create a process around giving them the opportunity to embrace the complexity of individual scenarios.
well, right. And to have the situational awareness to align resources with
Yeah.
need. We talk about things like the evolution of precision medicine, where we're really, instead of applying a blanket procedure to every patient essentially equally, we're going to be able to, and we must, fine tune those procedures. The other thing I think that's super important from a leadership and a management perspective is in the current structure with a highly centralized, increasingly centralized model of control. In many times, the key performance indicators that we use to assess success of processes are not necessarily aligned with the ultimate goal that the patient and the physician or the healthcare team have on the front lines. An example would be shortening length of stay. And I'm guilty of this, having presented a lot of papers where I say, well, the length of stay decreased. And that can be theoretically important from the perspective of throughput, but does it really necessarily align consistently with the goal of optimal patient outcomes?
Right.
And so we create that dichotomy between process key performance indicators that we hold people accountable to. And on the other hand, how do we define the attribution of improved patient care, particularly over a longitudinal time?
Absolutely. We've seen a lot of, I wanted to ask you about this. We've seen a lot of consolidation in the healthcare field. You see a lot of larger hospital organizations, healthcare systems acquiring some of the rural local hospitals. Is there, I guess one of my questions is why is that? Because I would assume it's financially based because I understand a lot of rural healthcare systems and local regional hospitals are struggling financially. But for the patients, they always wonder like how could they be struggling financially? Like is it the cost? Is it just inherent in the system given the way insurance works or reimbursement? Are they struggling with revenue cycle management? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in that question, and it's a very complicated in
It
so
really is.
many ways. So one of the challenges is that as we become more sophisticated in our delivery of healthcare, that then translates into increasing specialization and the demand for specialization.
And those
Oh,
aren't located everywhere, right?
well,
And so,
yes, that's correct. And you couldn't support them given certain population densities. You
right,
just simply don't have enough volume to support either the financial demand or the realities of the system that supports that. So for example, something like neurosurgery or complex cancer care. So that's one tremendous problem. There's no question that payment models and the realities of insured versus non-insured patients or patients insured by lower paying government providers like Medicaid, for example, can definitely impact the overall financial solvency.
sure.
I think, one of the real challenges that we have is how do we balance this need between availability of specialized resources and the realities in many parts of our country of a very low geographic density.
Right.
And I think that's something that we have not consistently grappled with. This idea of health system science is, well, how can we start to use innovation and technology to address some of those issues? And this is where I think optimistically we have a tremendous amount of opportunity with things like telemedicine, the Internet of Things, with wearable devices, the ability to gather information outside of the four walls of our clinics or our hospitals. Now, the challenge is how do we come up with payment models that really account for the value of that? We have not really consistently tackled that yet. And then the second thing is how do we effectively aggregate all that data into actionable information? And that's the key. It has to be information which then directly influences the way we deliver care.
What
So
has the
those are,
modern is yeah, excellent. That's excellent. That's a great insight. I mean, one of the questions I have is has the modernization or the digital transformation that's happened in healthcare, has that helped in that regard? Like gather up that data? I mean, I think back 20 years ago, I would go to the physician and the nurse would come in and have on pieces of paper, right, entire medical records and be like, hey, are you still taking this medicine? Or, hey, are you doing whatever the history was that was given before? And now it's all in tablets, it's all in a system, right? And I would think there's a lot of data that can be drawn from those to make better decisions.
Yes, there's a lot of data, but we're still facing a bit of an uphill battle. The reality is, I believe, and I think many people would agree with me, that the electronic health record was largely initiated as a revenue cycle tool to optimize the billing and collections and documentation that directly related to the financial realities of reimbursement. That being said, it has evolved to become more patient friendly, more provider friendly, but we still have a couple of challenges ahead of us. One that's important is to really be able to convert, as I said, that data to actionable information. We get a lot of alerts, we get a lot of messages, and filtering through those currently is very manual.
Yeah.
So
So there's a
that's
lot of false positives, or there's a lot of noise,
a
really.
lot of
Isn't that?
noise in the
Yeah.
system. And so, it's human nature, if you're inundated with too much
Yeah.
data noise,
You turn off.
you turn off. And so then, unfortunately, the consequence of that is that we might miss something very important out of
Sure.
the noise. The other thing that I think is going to be truly revolutionary and a tipping point is when we move from a system that we currently have where the data is controlled by the provider side of the equation. Even though you and I have access to our portal, we don't truly own the data. We have to be given permission to view the data. And
Correct.
really, when you think about other data rich industries, it's largely the opposite, where the consumer is empowered by actually owning their own data. And when we flip that script, think about what will happen to the patient as a consumer and their ability to actually have more discretionary choice in the market.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, and that's happening in all the other industries, right? I mean, it really is. Patients are becoming well researched, in other industries and other verticals other than healthcare,
Yeah,
right? And I think your comment about Internet of Things, wearable devices, things like that. There's so much data that is collected, right? From the ring that you can wear that
right.
tracks your sleep and your blood pressure and everything, to the watches that you can wear and everything else. It's there's a remarkable amount of healthcare data that resides with each patient, but yet our
Yeah,
healthcare provider doesn't necessarily see it, right?
that's right.
And it'd be monumental if we could grant access to them to see it, to give us advice.
Yes, if it was curated,
Yeah.
assessed, it'd make a big difference. And then, as we think about this, then we can start to think about the precision medicine and individualized care. And I like people to think in terms of the context of health. So,
Right.
because we're all very different individuals with different realities that might even shift during the course of our lifetime. And so the context of health can include things like social determinants of health, which could be socioeconomics, different environmental realities. But then getting back to the context of health, the rural comment you made. It's very different. I give this example. I tell people, well, you can get something called the Area Deprivation Index from Medicare, which looks at zip code and estimates household earnings, education level, and things like that. So I could get the Area Deprivation Index, and let's say I had three patients that looked identical on paper. But what if I told you that one patient was in a very small town in rural Appalachia? One
Mm-hmm.
was on the south side of Chicago, and one was on a Native American reservation in New Mexico. They might look the same on paper, but even common sense would tell us those patients have very different healthcare needs. They have different access realities, car, driving, bus, whatever the transportation is. And even their community support and their view of trust that they have with the healthcare system can be quite different. So as we look at expanding our opportunities with technology and artificial intelligence and other advanced analytic techniques, we can really start to think, how can we incorporate this in things like the context of health genetics into our prescriptive care of patients?
Excellent. That's phenomenal. In terms of your leadership role and your team and building a positive culture to get people to deliver for you and to be as passionate as you are about things, what's inspired you, or what models or what other leaders have you looked to?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating question, and I think like a lot of us, I've evolved over time. I
Mhm.
must say that I really favor a largely decentralized model, where as a leader, I view my role as providing a vision and resources that align with the needs of other people to be successful. And there's a term that's used in organizational behavior sometimes called adhocracy,
Mhm.
which is attributed to NASA as the initial response to President Kennedy's challenge to put a man on the moon. And it really, if you think about it, it's the opposite of bureaucracy, where you
Right.
have a very hierarchical, very defined structure that, in my opinion, tends more towards management than leadership. Whereas an adhocracy is the idea that you have highly trained, highly educated, motivated people that really benefit from the vision, the resource alignment, and being given responsibility as opposed to always emphasizing accountability. I think responsibility really brings out the best in human initiatives and drive, and can be incredibly rewarding. I think, you ask about mentors, and of course, we've all, have several that probably influenced us quite a bit. I think in medicine, I was very fortunate to have several people who were very successful, particularly in the surgical world, who really inspired me to think in terms of, how do you optimize human performance for others? And that as a leader, that's really what contributes to your success. And to change the paradigm from, what am I doing for me, Doug Slakey, as opposed to, what am I doing for other people to allow them to achieve even more than they think they could aspire to.
Yeah. I mean, getting people to aspire to more and empowering them with the ability to have the end result in mind, but to do their own unique approach to solving it.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I love the decentralized model. I've always found that it works a lot better than a more bureaucratic top down approach. It's almost the definition of servant leadership, really, because
Well,
you're really empowering everybody, and then the result tends to be, my experience has always been, then they tend to work for you for a greater cause, and they do it with blood, sweat, and tears, as opposed to just checking in for the paycheck and checking out.
yeah, I think that's it. It's so important to have personal growth as a component of the expectations. I think the other thing that, as I was listening to you talk, the other really important component of success in that model is uh, a multiplier effect, and being able to recognize where there are opportunities for people to collaborate, to form even ad hoc teams that magnify or multiply the effect of each individual.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's the Clydesdale effect, as we like to say, right?
Oh,
Like an individual Clydesdale is incredible power, but you put two of them and you don't just get twice the amount of pulling power. You actually get about 8 times the amount when they work together.
yeah.
So it's a remarkable matter of science.
Yeah, in science that's, I think, directly relatable to human performance as well, right? People,
Yeah.
and that's in many ways, that's one of the challenging things to be successful at accomplishing, because sometimes the connections, as you know, between individuals or between teams of teams might not be overtly apparent. And you might not actually truly recognize the effectiveness. Like, I hadn't heard the Clydesdale analogy before, but I really like that. I'm going to use that one.
Yeah.
But it is that multiplier effect, and sometimes you have to try it. Might not work. It might not be need to be restructured, and that's the other thing that I think I've always tried to keep in my mind is that the pathway to success is not a linear one-way street. The pathway to success requires flexibility, adaptability, responsiveness. I really, I think, learned that lesson. I was in New Orleans for 21 years. Initially,
Mhm.
led the transplant program, and we built that from 40 transplants a year to over 200 in just 6 years. But when Hurricane Katrina happened, you really realize, well, how that there's a degree of fragility to what we expect as our that we take for granted as our infrastructure and the people we work with, and that to be successful in the face of adversity or change, you must be able to respond and adapt.
Yeah, natural disasters really have a way of giving a lot of life lessons. One of the things that happened in Katrina that few people realize is a lot of the backup of the data for the governments actually was all local and it
Yep.
was all on premise. So when it got wiped out by the floods, there literally were no records on the planet for home ownership and a lot of government records, identifications, a lot of that. And people like couldn't prove that they owned things. It was complete chaos, and it just had to do with, backing up of data and having things, secure. And when you were talking about rural healthcare too, I always, we deal with cybersecurity and things like ransomware attacks and things. They're devastating to rural communities because unlike 20 years ago when we had two versions, when there was still a paper version, we could still access that data physically. When those systems are down, like they can't render medical care, so the people in those rural communities have to go 3 hours away to go and get the same medical care. It's really a struggle, and there's been issues with it, causing damages. But it's tragic. The more we advance, there's
Yeah.
risks sometimes.
Well, there are certainly risks. I mean, in healthcare, it's fascinating. Even things that you think would be very simple. So, for example, actually physically writing a prescription. So,
Right.
I'm old enough that we all had our prescription pads and wrote the
Yep.
prescription. And now I can guarantee you there are physicians beginning their practices that have never handwritten a prescription. So
Right.
to your point, you get a ransomware attack, the electronic health record system goes down, somebody needs a medication, which could be a life-saving medication. How do you actually even begin that process
Right.
when you have never done it before manually?
Yeah. Well, and some of the younger physicians probably don't know how to write cursive because
Right.
the younger I've raised a lot of kids. So like some of my younger ones, like they don't understand cursive. So even if we gave them the pad and the pen, they may struggle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. It's no, but that's a great point because back in the day, the only risk was somebody would steal your pad, right? And they could forge it or something. And it's like, well, that was usually always caught,
Yeah.
because the signature would be wrong or whatever. And that's a very low risk. But now you're right. Those systems go down and people can't get the medicine that they need to survive.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you bring up such a good point about the risk of the way our healthcare system works and the data. And, getting back to that idea of who controls the data, there really isn't consistent redundancy there. And, it's funny, like what industry, this could be a quiz show question, is what remaining industry in the world still uses fax machines? And I think
Right. That's
no,
exactly right.
right, nowhere outside of healthcare, but we just have these tremendous remaining gaps
Yeah.
in the security of our health record, who truly is in control of the health record. How can we reduce the fragmentation? Maybe the fragmentation reduces some of the risk of cyber attack, but I don't really think so, because we're still faced with the possibility of big, tremendous gaps
Right.
in knowledge and history.
Yeah. So, in terms of your own origins, like, did you always know you wanted to be a physician when you were younger? I mean, in some people that we interview, they have completely diverse beginnings to where they wind up when we're speaking to them. Like, I was a philosophy major in school back in the day. Now I run a biopharma company, and I'm like, hang on, how did that happen, right? But I mean, obviously, with physicians, I imagine it's a relatively traditional arc, I would assume.
Yeah, relatively traditional. So I think, like a lot of people, clearly some of the influence came from family, although I was really the first to go into healthcare from my family. But for whatever reason, there was sort of this unspoken, I guess, expectation. But I'll tell you honestly, in undergraduate, I was a history major.
Really?
Yeah, the University of California, Berkeley. So I did history, and my focus was on colonial American history, but also did all the pre-med courses. So I was sort of headed that way. And then I did take an interesting turn. So while an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I took a couple of public health courses, and I became very
Oh,
interested. And actually enrolled in a doctoral program in public health after undergraduate. I sort of envisioned myself going to the CDC or NIH or
right.
something like that.
Yeah.
But I opted out of it after 2 years with a master's. I said, I don't know if I really want to do that. And we do all have twists and turns. For a while, thought I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon and actually had all the residency applications, but then really didn't like my rotation in orthopedics, believe it or not. And
Was it
that,
contextual? Like, I'm curious why you chose to
yeah,
go into the actual
well,
surgery, the transplant surgeries. Like,
yeah.
what led you into that?
Yeah, the interesting thing about transplant surgery, at least traditionally, and I think it's still true to this day, is that as a surgical specialty, it's one of the few that really looks at a patient relationship over a long term.
Sure.
Many people go into procedural specialties because honestly, the interaction with the patient is short and defined by
Yeah.
a specific episode. But in transplant surgery, we tend to know our patients for a very long time. And I'll tell you, I'm really blessed. I have patients that I did a liver transplant on 20 years ago, some of them when they were little babies, and they still have my cell phone number. And they'll,
That's
particularly
fantastic.
around Thanksgiving and Christmas, they'll text me and let me know how they're doing. And so it's those long-term relationships, I think, that drew me to transplant. And then the other thing I really enjoyed was it's a highly technical specialty, but at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of science with immunology, infectious
Mm,
disease, the process of rejection. And so I think I'm obviously biased, but I think transplant surgeons tend to do have a holistic approach to the way they view their patients and populations that could benefit from a transplant, like people with kidney disease on dialysis, for example.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Is there generally, I mean, what is the backlog generally. Somebody needs a new kidney,
Well,
and it's going to depend on a bunch of different factors, as I understand, right?
yeah,
Like it depends on their age, etc., and then the availability.
of organs. Yeah, it's it really is a problem which has yet to be solved.
You would think with all the advancements that we would
Yeah.
have a surplus of
Well, I
things,
think
but
that, on the one hand, you look at, well, of course, we can do some living donor transplants, but
mhm,
unfortunately, one of the realities is if you have in certain populations, especially if you have something like kidney disease, the risk factors, obesity,
right,
diabetes, hypertension, can run in the families. And so then people are not eligible to be a living donor. And the other thing, even in the last, I really started in the 90s. And even since then, we have seen, I guess, fortunately, a decrease in the number of people who are dying from causes that in the early years would have made them sort of the ideal organ donor. So,
right. That's a
motorcycle
good point.
laws,
Yeah,
safer cars. We're just not seeing those sort of accidents. So, more and more now, we're seeing people donate organs who are older, who may have died of a stroke or something like that, as opposed to younger, sort of tragic motor vehicle and motorcycle accidents. So, it's good on the one hand that our
right. Yeah,
safety,
yeah, I see that, right?
yeah,
It's good that overall those safety standards are working in
right.
effect, but it is having a long tail effect.
Yeah. I think that, there's a tremendous amount of work being done on genetically modified, what we call xenotransplants. So those are transplants between species. And then most commonly, what's been in the news is a pig to human, right? Like there've been a couple of those kidney transplants recently. That with the genetic technologies that we have and that are evolving, I think there's a real possibility that that might become truly a resource. In addition, there's been some very intriguing work on essentially 3D printing or growing of organs from stem cells that still isn't nearly at the point where it's viable for transplantation, but it's a very intriguing work that's moving quite rapidly.
Well, that'll be remarkable to see. I mean, especially in the coming years, it seems like things advance so quickly, but it
Yeah.
still has to be tested and vetted for safety.
Yes, absolutely. There's definitely some safety concerns. One of the safety concerns with cross species transplants, as you might imagine, is the inadvertent transmission of infectious disease,
Right, of course.
like viruses and the like. So that's something we have to be aware of and put
So it's really
into.
about calculating risk,
It's
right? Like you
calculating
just
risk.
have to understand the risks and
Yeah,
then make the call based on that.
yeah, it's 100% correct. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we falsely believe that medicine has gotten to the point where we can manage risk comprehensively,
Right.
and and we're always going to have to accept, some
It's
risk,
still an
especially.
art to a lot of degree. There's still an element of art as well as the science, right?
Yeah,
You still have to have speculative risk along the way.
that's
Well,
true.
Doctor, thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight. Remarkable stories. So we really, really appreciate what you've done, all that you've done for the communities, and sharing your story with us. What's on the horizon? I know you're flying out later on today. What do you have some public speaking coming up? Some
Yeah,
panels?
I think we're doing some speaking. What I'm really excited about, though, is this um, sort of sandbox that we've created within this collaborative, where we're bringing, it's that multiplier effect, right?
Mhm.
Where we're bringing people together and organically already seeing opportunities to look at innovative approaches to optimize patient care in different settings. And um, That's really where I'm focusing my energy now is how can we contribute in a positive way and how can we really help optimize that human performance on the front lines of healthcare. It's such a critical, and you shouldn't even have to say it. It's so obviously critical, but it's something that we need to emphasize and really align innovation, education, and resources to make it reliable and consistent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have the benefit, I imagine, of having people involved in healthcare, so there is a bigger cause than just themselves. So,
Yeah.
right, but organizing them, giving them a target, inspiring them to deliver on it. That's where
Yeah.
leadership, like what you provide, does.
Well, and I'll leave you and the audience with just one final thought that I incorporated into the last chapter of my book is on compassion because I really believe that has to be the foundational element on which all these improvements rest. And one of the things that we're challenged with in healthcare that leaders especially need to grapple with is we've created these false us versus them dichotomies. And
Right.
I like to
Absolutely.
people to always reflect on the fact that at some point in our lives, every one of us will be a patient and every one of us will be a caregiver. It's a natural
Right.
reality of human existence. And so
It's the
if we,
normal trajectory of life.
it absolutely is. So really, healthcare systems, healthcare improvements is about us. It's not about us versus them.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Doctor. Really appreciate the time.
All right. Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks.